Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to jump right into a really visceral, honestly terrifying scene to understand the arithmetic of the ambush. Picture this. It's March 1945. You're on a wooded hillside near the Roer River. A German Volksgrenadier squad is perfectly dug in behind a stone wall. They've got an MG-42 machine gun, about 200 meters of open ground, and a column of American infantry walking literally right into their sights. This is a textbook German ambush, set up by absolute veterans who have used this exact tactic to completely devastate armies all across Europe. The trap is sprung, the machine gun absolutely rips the air apart, and then, spectacularly, the ambush just completely fails. Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly did 30 seconds of guaranteed chaos turn into an absolute death trap for the people who actually set the ambush? The German MG-42 tactic was this tried-and-true formula that had just crushed British, French, and Soviet units. Yet against the Americans, the fundamental math of the ambush just completely stopped adding up. What should have been an hour-long, dominant firefight collapsed in literally a matter of minutes. To really understand why this happened, we have to look at the brutal math of the battlefield. You see, an ambush isn't just about bullets. It's actually a massive bet on human reaction time. The Germans expected exactly 2 seconds of a psychological flinch from their targets. In those 2 crucial seconds, while the enemy naturally froze and scrambled to figure out where the fire was even coming from, that MG-42 would pour in 40 rounds of completely unanswered fire. That was the magic formula. But the stark contrast in hardware is exactly where this math begins to dramatically shift. For basically every other army in the world, they were living in the bolt-action reality. They were firing maybe 10 to 15 aimed rounds a minute because, you had to manually work the bolt between every single shot. But the American reality was entirely different. They carried the semi-automatic M1 Garand, which meant they were putting out 40 to 50 aimed rounds a minute. This single weapon absolutely changed the arithmetic of those first 3 crucial seconds of any firefight. So this massive difference in hardware completely dictated squad design. The German squad was built entirely around the MG-42. Now, it was devastating for sure, but it was a single point of failure. If that gunner went down, boom, 80% of the squad's firepower just vanished instantly. The American squad, on the other hand, had distributed firepower. Even without their heavier weapons, 8 Americans with Garands were outputting 320 aimed rounds a minute. There was no single switch you could just turn off to make them go quiet. The Garand, however, was really just the beginning. The anatomy of the American response relied on 3 distinct layers that transformed this ambush from a simple tactic into a completely lethal trap. Step 1 was that instantaneous wall of Garand return fire. But it's steps 2 and 3 that truly flip the script on the Germans. Layer 2 introduces the Browning automatic rifle, or the bar. While the Garands were firing, the barman was already on the ground, just hammering the German muzzle flashes. This locked the German gunners face down in the dirt. And because the enemy was pinned, the American riflemen could easily split and move forward, firing their semi-automatics right from the hip as they flanked. The Germans actually had a terrifying word for what this felt like. A Feuersturm, a firestorm that came from everywhere and simply never stopped. And this wasn't some slow, deliberate chain of command at work either. A sergeant in the 2nd Infantry Division at Hill 192 recalled how, when an ambush was triggered, every single Garand opened up simultaneously without an order. It was just instinct and training. This distributed firepower reflex was so incredibly deeply ingrained in these soldiers that it acted like a nervous system reacting to pain. But there's a third layer here, the invisible layer. While the riflemen flanked and the bar suppressed, there was this unseen hero in the American formation, a man lying totally flat in a ditch, maybe 30 meters behind the contact point, wearing the exact same muddy uniform, whispering just 6 digits into a 35-pound radio handset. This was the forward observer. This third layer was an absolute organizational triumph. While the German system relied on these fragile telephone wires and took 12 to 15 minutes to call in a strike, which, let's be real, is an absolute lifetime in a firefight, the American Fire Direction Center, or FDC, was totally radio-bound. The forward observer didn't even have to do the math. He just called in the coordinates, and the FDC could converge division-wide artillery onto that exact spot in just 3 minutes. All of this built into a terrifyingly compressed window for the enemy. At 0, contact is made. By 2 seconds, the Garands are already firing back. By 30 seconds, the bar has the enemy totally suppressed. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the FDC has computed the coordinates. And right at the 3-minute mark, time on target is achieved. This meant all 18 shells from multiple different batteries arrived at the exact same second. No ranging shots, no warning. Just absolute, sudden destruction. It became so brutally predictable that the Germans turned it into a grim formula. A captured German officer actually explained that they had to constantly ask themselves, can we inflict enough damage in 3 minutes to justify what will arrive in minute 4? And honestly, the answer was almost always no. This clinical equation meant that setting an ambush against an American infantry squad effectively became a suicide mission. But this system wasn't totally invincible. In November 1944, the narrative takes a really dark turn. The American military machine faced a catastrophic breakdown in a 50-square-mile black tangle of fir trees known as the Hurtgen Forest. Right here, the unstoppable American reflex met its ultimate countermeasure. Ernest Hemingway, who was acting as a correspondent at the time, called it Passchendaele with tree bursts. This dense forest completely stripped away everything the Americans relied on. There was literally no visibility to aim the Garand. There was no open space to flank the enemy. And worst of all, when the forward observers called in artillery, the shells would hit the dense canopy way up above, showering their own men with lethal wood and steel shrapnel. Their absolute greatest weapon was turned directly against them. The toll was just devastating. 2,800 casualties in just 18 days for the 22nd Infantry Regiment. This definitively proved that the American ambush-breaking system wasn't magic. It was highly, highly dependent on environmental variables like visibility, maneuverability, and having an open sky. The survivors walked out of that forest fundamentally changed. They had learned lessons literally written in the blood of their friends. They realized their system strictly needed space and sky to function, and they vowed never, ever to let a sequential delay cost them lives again. They synthesized their tactics right then and there, deciding that waiting even a few seconds between returning fire, flanking, and calling artillery was just too long. So when they pushed into the open Rhineland in early 1945, the response became blindingly fast, a true 90-second annihilation. The Grands cracked, the BARs hammered, and the radios transmitted, not in a sequence anymore, but totally simultaneously. It became a single fused reflex. A Volksgrenadier company set an ambush, expecting to hold an American platoon for an hour, and they completely ceased to exist in under 3 minutes. This incredibly compressed American reflex completely shattered German doctrine. A Volksgrenadier major actually gave this chilling standing order: do not initiate contact with American infantry unless you can destroy them in 60 seconds. If you cannot guarantee both conditions, do not fire. Think about that. The American system had squeezed the survival window of a German ambusher from 3 whole minutes down to just 60 seconds. Section 19. The Ultimate Stress Test. Hill 314. Now, to truly appreciate the massive scale of what this system could achieve, we have to look back slightly to August 1944. Roughly 700 Americans were cut off and surrounded for 5 agonizing days, somehow holding off an entire German Panzer Corps. And the anchor of this entire defense was the unseen hero of Mortain, forward observer Lieutenant Robert Weiss. For 5 sleepless days, Weiss lay in a shallow hole with his radio handset, repeatedly calling down division-level artillery to absolutely shatter incoming German armor every single time they massed for an assault in the fields below. And the absolute trust placed in this system is highlighted by one jaw-dropping number: 100 meters. On the second day, the Germans pushed so incredibly close that Weiss did the unthinkable. He called for an artillery strike just 100 meters from his own position. He completely trusted the system's math, and it worked. The shells landed exactly where he asked, breaking the German assault and saving his men without obliterating his own lines. It's really vital to remember exactly who was executing this lethal precision. This wasn't done by some highly trained special forces unit. It was carried out by 20-year-old draftees. We're talking clerks from Ohio and farm boys from Nebraska. They didn't need to understand the complex geometry and math happening at the fire direction center miles away. They just had to firmly trust the radio and trust the math that was designed by officers in Oklahoma a whole decade prior. As American teams rapidly advanced through the Rhineland later in the war, they found this really haunting, wordless story left across Europe's roads. At hundreds of textbook ambush sites, they found what they started calling the geometry of the dead. German soldiers positioned facing forward for the initial ambush and then turned completely backward, frozen in a desperate attempt to flee the devastating, instantaneous artillery that had trapped them right in their own kill zones. Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought to leave you with today. What happens when an army stops fighting the men directly in front of them and is instead forced to fight a massive, invisible system? The Germans weren't just outfought here. They were totally outbuilt by a brilliant organizational decision made in the 1930s that flawlessly connected a rifleman, a radio, and the sheer math of destruction. It quite literally redefined warfare forever. Thanks so much for exploring this incredible slice of history with me today, and keep learning.